Welcome to this MED event. Today we host a conversation on Qatar, the country that organizes the FIFA World Cup 2022 from 20 November. An international sport event always catalyzes global attention, reaching a wide audience. And this is the first time that a Middle Eastern country organizes the World Cup. So it's really the right time to enlarge our understanding of Qatar, a tiny but very ambitious state, trying to figure out if really all the routes lead to Doha, as our event title. I'm Eleonora Ardemagni, Associate Research Fellow at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, and this webinar is part of ISPI online initiatives in the framework of MED, Mediterranean Dialogues 2022, the annual high-level conference promoted by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and ISPI. I'm glad to introduce our panelists, who are three distinguished experts on Qatar and the Gulf region. So my warm welcome to Gerd Nonneman, Professor of International Relations and Gulf Studies at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar. He is also the excellent editor of the Journal of Arabian Studies, a leading academic publication, and he authored many books and book chapters on the Gulf region and its international relations. Welcome also to Robin Mills, CEO of Qamar Energy and leading expert on energy strategy and economics. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and a columnist for The National, the main Emirati newspaper in English language, and Bloomberg. And welcome to Dania Tafer, Executive Director of Gulf International Forum in Washington. She is also a professional lecturer at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, with a strong expertise on Gulf geopolitics, US Gulf relations, and the political economy of the GCC states. Unfortunately, Anna Jacobs was no longer able to join the debate. As you know, this is an interactive panel, so please submit your questions through the QA function of the platform, and we will choose the most interesting of them for the last part of the event. The World Cup is a global showcase for Doha. The Emir of Qatar, Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, has recently denounced, I quote, an unprecedented campaign of criticism towards the Emirate. In fact, despite some starting reforms, the approaching of the soccer event has sparked international media debate on human rights, women's rights, low-paid workers, and environmental issues in Qatar. In this panel, we will focus instead on Doha's foreign and energy policy, its soft power, and global projection. Since the World Cup is for Doha also a way to announce external alliances and also to improve security capabilities. Think that more than 1 million of soccer fans are expected in the Emirate. And Qatar has a population of only 3 million people. So the Emirate is going to deploy tens of thousands of security forces to ensure a safe World Cup. And for this reason, Doha signed security cooperation deals with 13 countries, mainly Arab and European states. For instance, Turkey sent 3,000 riot police officers. This is an example of how big events contribute to announce regional and international alliances. There's another interesting point for me. The field exercises performed by Qatari security forces and foreign participants before the World Cup were called Watan, which in Arabic means nation. And this is just to underline that what's at stake for Doha, since hosting the World Cup is for the Emirate also a way to display strength, influence, and national prestige. Gerd, I would start with you. From a political and image perspective, Qatar has invested a lot in the FIFA World Cup. Your colleague, Professor Mehram Kamrava, titled his brilliant book on Qatar in 2013, Small State, Big Politics, just to outline Doha's subtle power. How would you define its current strategy, and how does Doha want to present itself to the world? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. It was refusing to unmute myself. So anyway, thank you for this introduction, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel. As I was saying, it's almost as good, but not quite, as being in Rome. But that's for another occasion. So the World Cup is not just, as you indicated already, for the sake of the World Cup and for football. However, football mad many in the country are, particularly in the ruling family. It's really a part of a long-term security project, not just military, but also economic. So it's that is a two-pronged strategy of which the World Cup project has been part from the beginning. So security in terms of long-term economic survival beyond reliance on hydrocarbons, and that requires a diversified economy. And the World Cup is just one of many ways in which they've been trying to generate some alternative, some complementary activities, sectors in the economy, in this case, major events in which they want to become a major world hub. So the World Cup's got to be seen as part of that long-term economic development project. That's also why, incidentally, when people talk about the huge cost of $200+ billion, that's not been spent strictly on the World Cup, but it's spent on the overall infrastructural and economic development of the country, except in an accelerated way. The World Cup expenditure or project was integrated with that larger project right from the word go. So that's the economic, long-term economic pillar. On the other side, as you say, there is the more traditional security pillar. Qatar was always small, vulnerable, unknown, and the father emir, Sheikh Hamad, knew from personal experience, namely his involvement in the Qatari detachment, taking part in the liberation of Hafja, which had been occupied by Iraqi forces, how dangerous things can be in a rough neighborhood surrounded by big beasts. If you're small, vulnerable, and flat, you can be taken over, perhaps not quite by facts, as Saddam Hussein is supposed to have said, but very quickly in the space of a few hours. So that security ambition was always there from the beginning. So the security was always there from the beginning. Hang on one moment, please. Can you leave? Sorry, there's some misunderstanding here. Apologies for that.
No problem.
That ambition to secure little vulnerable Qatar, unknown Qatar, was always there. And how does one do this? How does one gain visibility? By, amongst other things, organizing major events such as this. Secondly, by developing global diplomatic networks of people who, if not friends, are at least sympathetic or don't see her as a threat. And thirdly, by developing global economic networks, which I'm sure Robin Mills will be talking about. And LNG, of course, is a huge global economic network. So in that second pillar of directly more traditionally security-oriented strategy, the World Cup was an obvious target to go for. It's one of the biggest global events, major events in the world. So it fits Qatar's overall broad strategy that was really crafted from the early 90s all the way till today.
Thank you, Gerard. So a broad strategy involving security and economic goals. And this is perfect to deepen our reflection also to energy. So I would leave the floor to Robin. As a prominent gas exporter, Qatar's international role has further strengthened after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And many European states are signing or aim to sign agreements with the Emirates for hydrocarbons, but also for renewable energies. How does Doha is playing the energy game? And in Qatar's perspective, which is the geopolitical trade-off, in your view, for the Emirates?
Well, Qatar's an enormously important player in this current situation because it's obviously the world's leading exporter of liquefied natural gas. Its exports are comparable to those of Australia and the US. They're all about equal. So it's very much the leading or one of the three leading exporters. But it also has very large expansion plans, of course. So at about its current capacity, about 77 million tons per year. You know, that's roughly a bit less than a quarter of the global market. And that's going to increase to 127 million by 2026, 2027. So that expansion plan is already very much well underway. Several major international companies, Shell and Total, most recently rewarded stakes in that development. So it's one of the countries that, along with the US in particular, a number of African countries, is going to be increasing LNG exports very significantly over the next 5 years or so. And Europe is obviously in a situation now that it's having to replace essentially all Russian gas imports. A small amount still continues. We'll have to see if that even goes on. But essentially Russian gas, which was supplying 40% of European gas consumption, is going to drop to 10% or less, and possibly effectively to close to zero. And there's no one supplier that can step in and make that replacement now. Indeed, over the next 5 years, the extra LNG from Qatar will help, but even then, it's only filling part of the gap. What Europe has been very concerned about this year, obviously, has been what can we get now? What LNG supplies or any supplies of gas or other energy can we get right now? And there was very little spare capacity in the global LNG system running up to this crisis. The market was already getting tight in 2021. And so all that can happen really is diverting LNG cargoes from certain destinations towards Europe. So there's been some expansion of supplies from the US, and Europe has emerged obviously as the dominant market for US LNG. But then within that, apart from that, the question has been, how much can Qatar divert? And that's why you have seen leading politicians from Germany in particular, but other European politicians visiting Doha, as well as some of its Gulf neighbours, and seeing what possibly could be supplied. There's two issues really that here for Qatar. One is that as I say, its LNG is already running at capacity. And secondly, that most of that LNG is already committed on long-term contracts and primarily to Asian countries. So the traditional LNG buyers in East Asia, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, but now increasingly emerging LNG buyers, particularly China, of course, but also other Asian countries, including South Asia. And so Europe has really been in the case of trying to pay very high prices to bid away the relatively small amount of flexible cargoes, and to explore whether Qatar would divert any of the cargoes in the long-term contracts. Qatar has been pretty clear that no, we're going to adhere to these contracts, And they are very much believers in long-term contracts, don't seem to want to move away from that model for most of their sales, even for the sales from the new LNG plants. There has been some diversion of cargoes, particularly from China, but that's really been kind of voluntary. China has said, well, we don't actually need all this LNG right now. Prices are so high, we're prepared to release a certain amount of that and resell it at a profit, of course, to Europe. And that's been very important for Europe that China has been able and willing to do that. We'll have to see, will that continue into next year if COVID lockdowns and so on relax in China, which would make the European situation much tighter. And Qatar really has a bit of a dilemma, or perhaps the dilemma really belongs more to Europe at the moment. As I said, Qatar is launching this huge LNG expansion, but it wants long-term contracts. And long-term would mean 10, 15 years at least, probably 20 years. Europe, on the other hand, says, well, we want LNG now. Perhaps we need it up to 2030 or so. We don't want it beyond that because we have a decarbonisation agenda. So we don't think we'll actually need that much gas by the 2030s. And anyway, we wouldn't want to use it for because of the greenhouse gas commitments that we have. And this is a disconnect that really affects all new LNG projects around the world. But in particular Qatar, because Qatar has been so firm on sticking to this policy. And Qatar also feels that I have options. Asia is very keen on my LNG. I have plenty of buyers knocking on my door. I don't need to do special favors to sell all this in the current market. And so that's really the key paradox that I think European policymakers and Doha need to find a solution to. How can Europe credibly commit to long-term contracts, but at the same time staying within its climate parameters?
Thank you, Robin. You mentioned the issue of long-term gas contracts for export, and this is extremely important as this stresses how much it's difficult to find quick solutions and how much long-term planning has always guided, as Gerd told previously, the strategic thinking of Doha, also for the organization of the World Cup. Daniel, I would focus now on regional balances. Since on June 2022, Qatar hosted European Union mediated indirect talks between the United States and Iran amid efforts to revive the 2015 nuclear deal. Which kind of role is Doha playing on this file on Iran? And do you think the Gulf Cooperation Council has a single strategy to follow in case the nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is not relaunched, as highly probable? Or we will see different strategies within the GCC, for instance, with Qatar leading dialogue efforts, maybe alongside Oman?
Interesting question, Eleanor, and it's one that's reoccurring. So Iran is kind of part of Qatar's soft power strategy, but also it's part of Qatar's national security strategy as well. As we recall, during the Gulf crisis, when Qatar was blockaded by other GCC states, Iran assisted Qatar in securing food and other items. And so Iran is actually important to Qatar in many different ways than it is for the rest of the GCC states. And as we know, Qatar has deployed really skillful state craft to offset their unfavorable position within the GCC, although it's much more favorable now than it was a couple of years ago. And on that note, in reference to renegotiating the JCPOA, Qatar would likely continue to play a mediation role, even if the JCPOA was not going to go through, which most people think it's not going to go through. And so it would continue to play back channel roles, indirect talks, even would be willing to host direct talks, of course. Now, in reference to the GCC states collectively, I think deep down inside, all of the GCC states really prefer to temper Iranian expansionism, but they all have very different strategies and different views on how to deal with Iran. For example, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain have much more antagonistic relations with Iran. And I believe if there's no JCPOA, they're going to continue to counter Iran more aggressively, and I think would be less prone to dialogue in this case. As we know, the UAE has kind of cooled relations with Iran more recently, and has been engaging with Iran. But we know also that the UAE has the largest trade relationship with Iran in the GCC. And Oman and Qatar, they will continue having robust, amicable relations with Iran. Oman has a long history of that, and I don't see that changing with Qatar in the near future. And Kuwait, which is the last one, has more of a balancing act, wants to have good relations, but is very careful in balancing its relations with the GCC and not rocking the boat, if you will. So that's the way I foresee it if the JCPOA doesn't go through. If it did hypothetically go through, I would see much more willingness for dialogue, especially, I think, on the Saudi side. Although there has been talks between Saudi and Iran more recently, it's gone hot and cold, and really there hasn't been much substance that came out of these talks. And I think Saudi is trying to assess where the JCPOA is going at this point to decide how it will respond.
Thank you, Dania. Sure. So many voices within the GCC on this topic, also because national interests are different. And we have also to remember that, for instance, energy is a natural driver of dialogue, I would say, between Qatar and Iran due to the shared property of the largest natural gas field, the offshore North Dome and South Pars. Thank you very much. Gerd, let's talk about the international relations of Qatar. Since Doha has a tight political and security partnership with the United States, in 2022, President Biden even designated the Emirate as a major non-NATO ally. However, Doha cultivates economic relations with China and also with Russia. Although the Qatar Emir was the only Gulf ruler to define the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an unjust war, it was during the Doha summit last March. How does Qatar has succeeded so far in striking a balance between its multiple international alliances?
Let me preface that by putting a footnote to what Robin was saying earlier about Qatar's insistence on long-term contracts, because that's at the heart of its economic interest. I think they will be willing ultimately to compromise somewhere around a 10 to 15 year long-term deal with Europe, and the Europeans will I think end up at somewhere between 10 and 15. So I think there's a possibility. Now that fits into your question, because Qatar would consider doing this, and that's coming down from 20, even possibly below 15, because they appreciate a diversified set of relationships around the world. That's part of that long-term vision, strategic vision of multiple relationships, networks of diplomatic support, sympathy, or acquiescence, as widely diversified as possible. That's been going on since the early 90s. as Sheikh Hamad got more grip on power. And then, of course, when he took power formally in 95, that really went into high gear. So the strategy in terms of international diplomatic connections, political connections, has always been twofold, well, threefold. One, utterly pragmatic, not ideological. And some of the things that people have portrayed as ideological commitments, perhaps support for Islamist parties and so on, actually derives from the pragmatic assessment of what they thought the dynamics of Arab politics were going to look like. Second, anchoring their security really in the US. In the hegemon of the day remains the US. They're the only one with a projection capability that can reach securely into the Gulf and beyond. So that is absolutely clear, and that's why, of course, they offered the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, the biggest US air base outside the US, crucial, without any costs to the US and without any conditions. Quite different from the arrangement that the US had in Saudi Arabia before. So that's one thing. But then the third pillar of the strategy is to make it a multiple network, a multifarious network, with lots of complementary relationships that balance also the image of security reliance on the US. And that means developing these relationships, sometimes in close connection, close almost alliance, like with Turkey at the moment, for instance, sometimes more modus vivendi. With Iran, for instance, I wouldn't characterize the relationship as very friendly or real friends or an alliance, let alone an alliance, but it's a pragmatic modus vivendi. Even when they were violently opposed to Iran's policy in Syria, for instance, where they supported opposing parties, they were able to separate that off a bit and deal with Iran in a pragmatic fashion because they couldn't do anything else. They realized Iran's not going anywhere. We share the gas field. Iran's a lot bigger than we are. And ultimately, they've come to the conclusion that in terms of bilateral relations, Iran can be lived with and should be lived with. But the broader idea is build relations with everyone, talk to everyone, except if they're potentially a real threat, and don't burn bridges. And by doing that, avoid problems, but also show yourself to be a potentially very useful interlocutor for lots of other parties that might not be able to talk to, such as Iran or Hamas or, you name it. Qatar has always been wanting to put themselves forward as a potential facilitator for those kinds of contacts. The Taliban was a perfect example. They had an office, they were given an office here because the US needed somewhere to have indirect and eventually direct talks with the Taliban. You can see that, so there's no contradiction in Qatar having these multiple, varying, very diverse relationships of players that on the face of it are contradictory. They're enemies of each other, but Qatar's kept the bridges with all of them and therefore made itself a useful interlocutor. The only breach, and now they are again in that position, the only break in that or aberration from that pattern was from 2010 or late 2010 to 2012, when Qatar really decided that, or the Qatari leadership decided, the old regimes like Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, Gaddafi, Assad, they were gone. They were on the way out. They passed their sell-by date. Future of Arab politics was going to be different, so we might as well ride that wave. Again, it was a pragmatic decision, but executed, let's say, without due diligence, a bit over-enthusiastically, and as a consequence, they were then temporarily seen as having taken position in these conflicts. They were no longer that neutral, unthreatening, good facilitator, and or at least some states stopped seeing them as that. But that by the end of 2012, they realized that they'd stuck out their necks too far. This had been a bit, overly optimistic, and they began to recalibrate. They didn't make U-turns, but they recalibrated, became more cautious, back into the old groove of that pragmatic policy of talking to everyone, being useful to everyone, and refusing to blow up bridges.
Yes, it's about parallel partnerships. So I agree with you that network is the most suitable word to define how Qatar's policy behaves in the region and also at international level. And this stance is extremely difficult to conserve in international, when the international order is so polarized, so conflictual. So this is a strong challenge for the Emirate, and also, for instance, for the United Arab Emirates that have a similar way to face regional and international politics. Robin, let's talk about energy again. Since on May 2022, the European Commission unveiled a strategic partnership with the Gulf document, with the purpose to relaunch the cooperation with the GCC states and also with Qatar for its primary role on the energy file. The document emphasizes Gulf's geostrategic role connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia. How much energy and infrastructures drive, in your opinion, the timing of this initiative? Or is it part of long-term planning, this time by Europe and the European institutions?
I think energy is absolutely a driver. And I mean, look, there have been discussions on a EU GCC free trade agreement that go back 15 years or more. Or let's better say, probably they pretty much ended 15 years ago or came into a period of stagnation. And I think, Europe had really forgotten the geopolitical and the geoeconomic importance of the Gulf and regarded it as an explorer of hydrocarbons, which Europe was getting off and therefore wouldn't be very significant in European policy in future. And that's a big contrast to how the Gulf has been regarded by the US through this period, but also by the UK and by some EU member states individually. If you take France in particular, there has been plenty of engagement with the Gulf, but not by the EU as an entity. So I think the timing of this renewed partnership absolutely reflects the renewed preoccupation with energy security and the importance of the Gulf in supplying oil and gas, and the recognition by Europe that yes, it would need additional supplies of oil and gas from non-Russian hydrocarbons, and that in any case it will be a major importer of oil and gas in the future, even if diminishing, and so the Gulf still maintains a role. And I think Europe for a long time saw its energy relations through the Gulf very much through a kind of climate and renewables lens, and really, and in that sense, a kind of secondary lens to other regions where it saw a kind of greater room for engagement on renewables. There's obviously, for example, if you take North Africa, a very direct link between Europe and North Africa in the field of renewables in terms of renewable exports of renewable energy to Europe, and that wasn't seen so much for the Gulf. So the Gulf becomes a kind of secondary role where European renewables companies perhaps could invest, and they could of course try and encourage more active climate policy in the Gulf, but otherwise a secondary location. That has really changed, and the partnership agreement, the partnership document that's been sent so far is very it puts energy very much at the centre of the relationship, but it still has to kind of tiptoe around the hydrocarbon area and still dress that up a lot in the kind of European preoccupations on renewables. I think that there's perhaps two more constructive areas where that engagement can take place in a way that's still kind of compatible with Europe's climate goals. One is on the side of hydrogen, and so far for the Gulf, that's really been focused on Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE as the supplier of hydrogen and its derivatives like ammonia into Europe and indeed other markets. But Qatar did recently announce a so-called blue ammonia project, so ammonia produced from natural gas but with carbon capture and storage, and that is its kind of first venture into the field of hydrogen and derivatives. So Qatar, obviously with its enormous gas reserves, could be a significant player in blue hydrogen and blue ammonia. And and that Europe is not so keen on that, but I think kind of reluctantly accepts that, yes, blue hydrogen as opposed to so-called green hydrogen or renewable-derived hydrogen could have a role as well. I don't think Qatar is so interested in green hydrogen, which requires large areas of land and renewable energy. Qatar's land area is obviously relatively small and will want to be reserved for its own renewable energy supplies. But the other side, I think, is on climate policy. And we've seen the Gulf states, and in particular, I'd have to say the UAE, but also in some extent Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, and maybe now Qatar emerging as more constructive climate actors. Qatar was obviously one of the Gulf states that actually, the only Gulf state that actually hosted the COP, the annual COP UN climate conference a few years back. The UAE will do so next year, and Egypt obviously this year. So in that sense, it had something of a lead on the climate negotiations. But I think now there's a view that the Gulf states actually have quite a lot to offer on the positive side of climate. In terms of areas like renewable energy investment, in terms of being renewable investors around the world, and including in Europe, as well as in their own domestic renewable sectors. I already mentioned hydrogen, and in the field of developing things like carbon capture and storage, which Qatar is very active on, and as well as some other Gulf countries. And in terms of trying to reduce the carbon footprint of oil and gas production, as much as that's seen by Europe as a kind of necessary evil, if it has to happen, at least it should be as low carbon as possible. And so you've seen a drive by Qatar to reduce the carbon footprint of its new LNG facilities by using renewable energy, by using solar power, which is being built by Total, of course, a French company, and by using carbon capture and storage.
Thank you, Robin, for this comprehensive perspective on the energy, renewables, and also climate nexus. I would also add that the EU and European states are growingly interested and also concerned about maritime security in the area. And this is strictly connected also to the energy issue. And Qatar is a leading player also on this point, and can also become some sort of bridge, as was previously said, in order to diffuse and de-escalate tensions also in terms of maritime security and freedom of navigation with Iran. This is really, really interesting. It's something that enlarges a bit the picture of how security looks like in the Gulf, and how European states look at security in the region and also at Qatar. Dania, I would come back a bit on the FIFA World Cup, the main topic of our discussion, since this is not only about soft power and image making for Qatar, but it is also a business opportunity. In your view, which is going to be the main impact and legacy of this event on the Qatari economy? And do you think the investments related to the World Cup will boost a lasting economic diversification, not only in Qatar, but also in the neighborhood, in the rest of the GCC?
So I've read different estimates about how much the World Cup is expected to contribute to Qatar's economy. I've seen something around $17 billion to $20 billion, but those are all estimates. And the World Cup, hosting the World Cup did escalate Qatar's economic diversification to a certain degree. I mean, the planning process and the investments into this event has been going on for years now, and there has been a movement towards more diversification in the Qatari economy. For example, the oil and gas sector decreased from 60% in 2011. By 2017, it was 48%. How much of that is related to the World Cup, I can't really say, but I still think that it did have some contribution. So to go into what are the pillars of Qatar's economy and a lot of the Gulf economies, real estate, hospitality, airlines, transportation and construction, the sports industry is growing and growing. And all of these are kind of expanded by the World Cup itself. So I don't know how much it changed the landscape in diversification, but it certainly contributed to primary industries that are diversified away from oil or gas to a certain degree, but are still kind of existent in the Qatari economy. The transportation sector will and has been experiencing a sharp increase in revenue. Foreign direct investment is another area. And the infrastructure investment and construction is a big one for the Qatari economy. Airlines, of course, are huge, not only for Qatar, but also for the Gulf region, the wider Gulf region, because everyone's going to be flying globally into the Gulf region. So now, in reference to after the World Cup, what I suspect could be an increase of foreign direct investment, an increase in tourism, and certainly an increase in the sports industry. So those are all areas that I suspect. Also, hospitality is very important. And when you look at the GCC-wide, that's important because many of the attendees will be staying at hotels across the GCC. So that's an important income source as well. Now, there are some concerns that have been raised about, making sure to be able to utilize all the infrastructure that was built in Qatar after the World Cup. And that's why I predict that the sports industry will grow in the country. So it's something that doesn't sit idle. And then maybe there will be a decrease in employment and the construction boom in Qatar with regards to expatriates probably from South Asia. So to sum it up, I foresee diversification in the sports industry, tourism industry, and obviously with those buttress the other aspects that are important to the pillars of the Qatari economy, such as hospitality, airline industry, and whatnot.
Thank you, Dania. Gerd, I would look now at how Qatar is playing its role in the Middle East, especially after the Al-Ula Accords in 2021 and the recent rapprochement between Egypt and Qatar. These events have formally solved the deep political rift in the Gulf Cooperation Council, as well as in the so-called Sunni camp. How do you see Qatar's role in the GCC now? And what about power balances on the Arabian shore of the Gulf?
Well, I mean, Qatar is obviously still a small state. Right, it is not a major military power. That's not changing, even though it's beefed up some of its military, the different aspects of its military and defense forces. But that's as much for symbolism and for insurance, really. You buy arms, which is what many of the states in the region have done. You buy arms, you kind of tie in the suppliers in the states that supply these arms, perhaps as sympathizers or having a stake in your security. But even so, it's not going to be the big military player. But they do have some extra heft because of that link with the US and the Al-Udeid base. In the GCC, even though it's the problem, the boycott's been formally resolved by the Al-Ula agreement, the Qataris will continue to treat that very pragmatically, like the rest of their foreign policy. They didn't want to see the GCC as an organization disappear. It retains some usefulness in sort of more technical areas of standardization and coordination and so on. And of course, it does remain, to some minor extent, a forum where some issues might be addressed that it might be more difficult to address if it didn't exist. But trust in the GCC as an organization, or a clear focus on orienting its security and diplomatic policies through the framework of the GCC, that's gone, and that will not return. There's a basic level of trust that's just been broken. That doesn't mean they can't cooperate. It doesn't mean they can't develop pragmatic, reasonable relations with Saudi Arabia, certainly with Dubai, if not with Abu Dhabi, and of course with Kuwait and Oman. There's never been an issue, but it's not a happy family. Let's put it that way. There's also, one has to remember the effect that the boycott had at a societal level in Qatar. It was traumatizing because 2 generations had grown up with the GCC in the background, thinking of themselves as Khalijis, investing across borders, studying across borders, marrying across borders, traveling without any issue across borders. And suddenly that was all ripped up overnight. That was a seriously traumatic event, and that still reverberates. So I think one has to be realistic about that. But as I say, as always, Qatar is clearly determined to be pragmatic, take the high road, as they might say, and in any case, that matches their more cautious approach, the return to their more cautious approach to foreign policy generally, the more carefully calibrated approach that they were typified or characterized for earlier, before the Arab Spring. But that's not to say that they have dumped certain principles. So, for instance, the idea that they would abolish Al Jazeera or completely constrain Al Jazeera, that's not on the table. That won't be. The idea that, as they were asked, they might declare the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, that won't happen because they are convinced that they're not. So that simply won't happen. But Qatar will want good, pragmatic relations on the peninsula and in the wider Middle East, especially also as far as it serves its economic interests. I mean, one of the reasons why relations with Egypt are important is investment. There's an economic return to be had, and Egypt at the moment seems to be responding. They will continue also to be active in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, largely to avoid being absent where others might be present, as well as for economic reasons. Surely,
and we saw the rise of Qatari nationalism due to the GCC crisis in 2017, and so the Khaliji identity suffered from this perspective. And joking a bit on this, I think that Qatar is going to continue to remember about the regional friends that helped Doha Indeed. During the blockade, so Turkey, Iran, and Oman.
And certainly Kuwait also.
And Kuwait, yes.
One of the biggest infrastructure projects that's now linking the airport with northern parts of Doha all the way to Lusail is the so-called Sheikh Sabah Al Ahmed Al Sabah corridor, an extraordinary new artery that's slashed traveling times through Doha, in more than half. And so it's visible to everyone, and it's called the Sheikh Sabah corridor precisely in recognition of Sheikh Sabah's role in trying to contain and resolve the boycott, the crisis.
Sure, thank you, Gerd. Robin, the Emir of Qatar met with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the recent Gas Exporting Countries Forum in Kazakhstan. And media reports wrote that this bilateral was aimed to diffuse tensions. Are tensions only about Doha's stance on the war in Ukraine, or is there a subtle competition also on gas export, especially towards European markets?
So this goes back quite a long way, this interaction between Russia and Qatar, particularly in the gas field, obviously to the point that Qatar was really expanding its global liquefied natural gas business in the early 2000s and becoming a significant competitor to Russia. And, if you go into the early 2000s, particularly up to 2007, 8, we were in perhaps a somewhat similar position to today with very rapidly rising energy prices and worries about shortages and so on. And Qatar's expansion at that point was very significant. And the GCF, the Gas Exporting Countries Forum, was formed based in Doha, obviously, but with strong inspiration from the Russians. And there have been at least one, I believe two, in fact, Russian Secretary Generals of that organization. And that's served to, as an idea to coordinate gas policies between the major exporters. And there are several major gas exporters that are obviously not members, and the US and Australia are two very important ones of those. But the hope that would develop into kind of gas OPEC, I think, to the extent that was ever a hope, perhaps on the Russian side, was never realistic given the structure of the gas market. So it's sort of more of a kind of coordination and information sharing kind of forum or organization. But obviously the Russians were concerned that Qatar would not take too much market share from them in Europe, and would not put too much downward pressure on prices in Europe. And in the end, that I think for other reasons that indeed that didn't happen. Qatar became a significant supplier to Europe, but not one that was seriously threatening the Russian position. Now I think in the current case, obviously with the invasion of Ukraine, again the Russians are concerned that their attempts to squeeze Europe on gas are not undermined by Qatar or by any other alternative supplier. Again, I'm not sure how seriously to take that, given that Qatar, for the reasons we've discussed, it doesn't have spare LNG. What LNG it has is tied up under long-term contracts anyway. It's not going to be able to displace Russia or to fully replace Russian exports to Europe anyway. By 26, 27, when the expansion comes into play, it will no doubt supply more to Europe, and we've discussed that before. But again, the global LNG business would have expanded by then anyway, and other countries will also need more supplies. So it's not clear that this is really a critical part of undermining Russian efforts to put pressure on Europe, and we obviously don't know what the military and political situation will be like by 2026 or 27 anyway. However, I think Qatar, as the other speakers have discussed, has this kind of multi-vector political approach and likes to talk to all parties or as many parties as possible and maintain at least reasonable relations with everybody, as indeed other Gulf states have done in recent years, certainly with respect to Russia. And Qatar has investments in Russia in the energy sector. It owns a few percent of Rosneft, the Russian leading state oil company. And then there's various points to discuss kind of joint projects with the Russians in the energy field, as have Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So nothing unusual in that. And I think this is this is really, we would expect things to continue. That Qatar will try to keep that door open and be perhaps a useful mediator at some point when mediation is possible.
Thank you, Robin, for this reflection. Dania, a significant part of Qatar's foreign policy is mediation. Think only to Afghanistan or more recently to Chad, for instance. However, since 2011, the Qatari foreign policy has also become politically assertive, often in competition with other Gulf and Middle Eastern players. Which phase of the Qatari foreign policy is prevailing now, in your view? The phase of the mediator or the phase of the ambitious state abroad? And what is the strategic direction?
Let me unmute myself. Well, I don't see those two as mutually exclusive. Undoubtedly, Qatar is really seduced by the idea that its politics outweigh its size, And I think that's part of ambition, but also part of its survival strategy. It's not in the friendliest of neighborhoods. It's pressed between two aspiring regional hegemons, Saudi and Iran. And therefore, it chooses to have a very active role in dealing with regional politics and shaping regional politics as a part of its survival. Qatar does well in exploiting opportunities in the global governance system to give it more leverage as a small state. And really, when you look at what are the roots of Qatari soft power, there's so many of them. I mean, some of the main ones that are mentioned often are, it's liquefied natural gas, its role in sports, and its diplomacy. These are important in the region. And an important component of that is Qatar's soft power and its mediation and conflict resolution. This also gives Qatar leverage with different regional actors, keeps doors open with different players. As Gerd discussed, Qatar's very keen on having diversified relationships or alliances, but I would be careful with the word, I guess, alliances. Qatar really aims to have a international brand of a responsible regional actor and a neutral arbiter in various regional disputes. And this actually made Qatar stand out here in the US. I mean, with the current administration, in reference to the debacle that happened in Afghanistan and how Qatar stepped in and played a key role in engaging with both parties, and even a humanitarian act in saving some Afghanis from the Taliban. And it's not only in Afghanistan, and we've seen this with its mediating role with Iran and other countries as well, and different players that many countries will not deal with in the region. And so I do think that Qatar finds its role in diplomacy and mediation key to its survival, to its diversification of relationships, both regionally and globally.
Thank you, Dania. So the main challenge, trying to sum up from this very rich discussion, the main challenge for Qatar is keeping on with a pragmatic stance in the region and at the international level, especially since we live in highly uncertain and also polarized times. And this is the main message of Qatari foreign policy, and also the main risk for its future trajectory. Thank you very much for this discussion. I see many questions from our public. Unfortunately, I can't open the floor since we have finished our time, but many of your questions were related to the GCC crisis, so we have already explored this topic, and also the security issues related to the FIFA World Cup organized by Qatar, and a bit on this was in my introduction. So I apologize with the public for not collecting questions, but really I want to thank you for attending this webinar, and thank you most of all to our guests for their time and precious comments. It was really a rich conversation as expected, so thank you to Gerd Noneman, to Robin Mills and Dania Taffer. ESP Med events continue soon, and so let's stay with us. Goodbye.